So I'm going to run you through three of these stories. I should tell you, you might be interested to know that the younger generation of Old Testament scholars, by and large, is studying this material in the Persian period. You can't find any scholars that are studying Deuteronomy or even the prophets. They're all doing this flaky stuff that is around the edges of the Old Testament, and they do that because they intuit that that's where the juices are for the church in the empire. I don't think most of them know that, but they intuit it. And I will explain it to them if they ask me. So the first of these three stories about agility, wit, and irony is the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. It's probably a Persian period story, scholars think. It's a model. You know about Pharaoh. Pharaoh was the breadbasket of the world. He controlled the bread supply because of the Nile. And in chapter 41 of Genesis, he has a nightmare. Isn't it interesting that the people who have the most have the worst nightmares? They have the worst nightmares about not having enough and running out. He didn't understand his nightmare. He had a dream about 7 fat cows who were eaten up by 7 lean cows and 7 healthy stalks of wheat that were eaten up by 7 stalks of wheat that had blight and mildew. He couldn't figure that out. So he went to his intelligence community. They're called magicians. And like most intelligence community says, gee, I don't know. We didn't get that report. We missed that piece of data. So the empire is frustrated. It can't understand. Because as Freud understood, and Jews have always understood, dreams are subterranean messages from God when your guard is down. It's underground work. So Pharaoh said, how do you think I could find out about this? He said, why don't you find a Jew? Jews know about dreams. Jews are the antecedents of Freud. They all know about dreams. So he found Joseph in prison as an enemy of the state, but he cleaned him up and brought him into the royal palace and said, oh, I know what that nightmare means, sir. That means you're going to have 7 good years, and then you're going to have 7 years of crop failure and famine. And Pharaoh said, what do you think I ought to do? He said, I think you ought to appoint a food czar. You ought to get somebody who's really smart. And Pharaoh said, you got any nominees? And then Joseph pulled a Dick Cheney. You remember Dick Cheney? Dick Cheney, it's not often remembered, Dick Cheney was appointed by George Bush to chair the committee to find a vice presidential candidate. And Dick Cheney said, I nominate moi. I'm not making this up, it's in the Bible. So he became the food czar. The Genesis 41 says Pharaoh dressed him up and gave him a chariot, and he was the second-ranking guy in Egypt after Pharaoh. Now, the way we read the Joseph story in our piety, he says, God sent me to provide food for my brothers. So nice. That's the only text you get in the lectionary. We never read Genesis 47. Because Genesis 47 says the famine did come. And the peasants came to Joseph and said, we need food. He said, I got all the food. I'll sell you some food. He sold them food. And the second year they came for food, and he said, well, you don't have any money. You can't buy any food from me. And he said, well, I'll take your cattle. I'll take your means of production. You take cattle away from peasants, they're out of business. The third year, they came for food. He said, we don't have any money, you don't have any cattle. You know what they said? They said, take our bodies and take our land and make us slaves, but feed us. We don't often recognize, you see, it's just 2 pages from Genesis 47 to Exodus 1. We don't think about how did those guys get in slavery. They got in slavery through the manipulation of the economy. That's how people get in slavery. And then 47 goes on to say, so Pharaoh owned all the land. And they said to him, thank you so much for making us slaves. We're so grateful to you. That's what it says. And the last line says, so Pharaoh owned all the land except the land of the priests. Because you got to have somebody to bless the monopoly. Now, if you think about accommodation and resistance, Joseph is a model of pure accommodation. He forgot that he was an Israelite. He signed on with a national security state without a whisker of reservation. One conservative scholar has said Joseph was completely Egyptianized. That's one model. And a lot of us baptized people are completely Egyptianized because we had really smart parents that said, oh, don't raise all that stuff about the gospel. That won't get you anywhere. Focus on your day job. Let somebody else worry about that other stuff. Second story that they told is the book of Esther. Esther is clearly a Persian narrative. It's all set in a Persian environment, and it names the Persian king Artaxerxes, or I think it's called Ahasuerus, but that's Artaxerxes in another form. So it's explicitly, and what scholars say, it's clearly fiction. What scholars say is that it is carnivalesque. It's like a literary, imaginative carnival that is so overstated that it's designed to make fun of everything and everybody. And Jews are supposed to read it to say, oh, isn't it great to be a Jew? What a bunch of dopes those Persians are. God, we're the best. So the way the book of Esther works is that Mordecai, the Jew, was a big imperial official. So the story says to the Jewish boys and girls, you can make it in the empire. Look at Mordecai. But there was another officer named Haman who wanted to kill all the Jews, and he wanted to kill Mordecai. That's the premise of the story. There are guys in the Persian Empire that want to kill the Jews. Esther, Jew. Esther was a Jew, but she kept her Jewishness hidden. She was beautiful. She was a beauty queen. But she didn't want anybody to know she was a Jew. She had passed, as they say. Mordecai came to her and said, we need to get your ass in gear about this Jewish stuff. A lot's lost in translation. And Mordecai says to her, listen, if you're a little Jewish boy or girl now, Mordecai says to her, if you think you'll be safe because you hide your Jewishness, you're mistaken, because when they come after the Jews, they'll come after all of us, and they will get you too. So you better come out of the closet about your Jewishness. And he says to her famously, for such a time as this, God has called you. And she rises to the occasion, and she says these most noble words. She says, I'll do it, and if I perish, I perish. What the hell? I'm going to be a Jew. So the rest of the story is about how Esther, helped by Mordecai, advances in power and finally becomes the Jewish queen of the Persian king. And the carnivalesque stuff is that they have all of these banquets, and the narrative endlessly describes all the musical instruments of self-indulgence and all the princes and all the satraps and all the governors. It's all overstated. And then Esther plays her Jewish card because the king says, oh, my beloved queen, what would you like? Anything you'd like? Half the kingdom? No, she says, I just want you to get Haman. Haman had built a gallows to hang Mordecai the Jew, and the story does a reversal so that Haman is hung on the scaffold that he built to get the Jews. And the way the story works in chapters 8 and 9, at the end, is that the king gives Esther permission to kill all the enemies of the Jews. You can see why we don't read it. And it ends in the festival of Purim, which means casting lots. And as you may know, Purim is the only Jewish festival that's not religious. It's just fun and play and games and how great it is to be a Jew. So tell that to the little Jewish boys and girls. Be a Jew. Be a Jew in the empire. Be a bold Jew. Be a smart Jew. Move in and occupy power and act for the sake of the Jews. What I want you to notice is the contrast between these two narratives. Joseph forgot his Jewishness and made it big in the empire. That's a model. Esther capitalized on her Jewishness